Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. Memory is a strange and fragile container. It is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, a story we tell ourselves, edited with every retelling. We smooth over the inconsistencies, fill in the blanks, and discard the details that don't fit the narrative we've chosen. Most of the time, this is harmless. It is how we make sense of our lives. But what happens when a life depends on the cracked and faded blueprint of someone else's memory? What happens when the story told by the state, the story of a crime, is built on the shifting sands of a teenager's recollection of a Wednesday afternoon that was, until it wasn't, completely unremarkable? January 13, 1999 was one of those days in Baltimore County, Maryland. A biting winter cold had settled over the sprawling suburbs. A recent ice storm had glazed the trees and closed schools for 2 days, a welcome disruption for the students of Woodlawn High School. Now, back in the fluorescent-lit hallways, life had returned to its familiar rhythm. It was a day of classes, of gossip whispered by lockers, of after-school plans made and broken. It was a day of notes passed in class, flirtations in the hallway, and the quiet, persistent anxieties of looming college applications and the vast unknown future that lay just beyond graduation. It was a day like any other, a single mundane thread in the complex tapestry of adolescence, destined to be forgotten. Except it wasn't. Because on that day, an 18-year-old senior named Hae Min Lee vanished, and in the frantic search that followed, and the grim discovery weeks later, the memories of that ordinary Wednesday would be placed under a microscope. They would be stretched, twisted, and scrutinized until they formed the backbone of a murder conviction, a conviction that would, decades later, crumble under the weight of its own profound uncertainty. To understand the story, you must first understand the world of Woodlawn High in 1999. It was a world of dualities, especially for its many first- and second-generation immigrant students. They lived between cultures, navigating the freedoms and expectations of American teenage life while honoring the traditions and strictures of their parents' homelands. This was the world of Hae Min Lee and Adnan Syed. Hae Min Lee was a force of nature. An immigrant from South Korea, she was effervescent, ambitious, and deeply loved. She excelled at everything she put her mind to. She was a dedicated student with a sharp intellect, a talented athlete on the school's lacrosse and field hockey teams, and the diligent, organized manager of the wrestling team. Her friends remember her for her radiant smile, her infectious booming laugh, and a fierce loyalty that made her a cherished confidant. But beneath this bright exterior was the constant pressure to be the perfect daughter in a traditional Korean family. She worked a part-time job at LensCrafters, helped care for her younger cousins, and was expected to uphold the conservative values of her home. Her diary, a poignant and private record of her teenage years, reveals a girl grappling with love, identity, and the chasm between the life she lived at school and the one she lived at home. Adnan Syed appeared to be her perfect counterpart. The son of conservative Pakistani Muslim immigrants, he was the personification of the golden boy. He was handsome, charming, and universally popular. He was an honor student, a volunteer EMT, the star kicker for the varsity football team, and had been crowned Woodlawn's homecoming king. Like Hae, he was a bridge between two worlds, adept at being the devout son at the local mosque, while also being a typical American teenager who went to parties, smoked weed, and dated. His friends described him as kind, gentle, and goofy, not someone known for a temper or jealousy. Their romance was the stuff of high school legend, secret, passionate and fraught with the drama of defying their parents. They met at a school dance, and for nearly a year they were inseparable. They left notes for each other between classes, stole moments in the school parking lot, and communicated through pagers and the nascent technology of email. Their relationship was an island they had built for themselves, away from the watchful eyes of their families, for whom such a romance would have been deeply taboo. But by the end of 1998, the pressures had taken their toll. The secrecy, the arguments, the cultural divide, it had become too much. They broke up, got back together, and then, just before the new year, broke up for what seemed like the final time. Hae had a new boyfriend, a sweet, slightly older young man named Don, who she worked with at LensCrafters. Adnan, by all accounts, was sad but appeared to be moving on. The relationship, with all its intensity, seemed to have run its course. On the morning of January 13th, Hae Min Lee arrived at school like any other day. She attended her classes, chatted with friends. Sometime during the day she spoke with Adnan. He asked her for a ride after school. He said his car was in the shop. This was a common occurrence. They had remained friends after the breakup. Hae initially agreed, but later told him she couldn't, because she had to pick up her 6-year-old cousin from kindergarten and then go to her shift at LensCrafters. This brief, mundane conversation would later be interpreted by prosecutors as a fatal lure. After the final bell rang at 2:15 p.m., Hae was seen by friends buying a snack from a concession stand in the gymnasium lobby. She was wearing her wrestling team jacket. She was in a hurry. She mentioned the ride she couldn't give Adnan. Then she walked out of the school doors and into the winter afternoon and was never seen alive again. When she didn't arrive to pick up her cousin, her family knew immediately that something was wrong. This was not like Hae. She was meticulously responsible. Panic set in. They called her friends. They called the police. That evening, Officer Scott Adcock called Adnan's Syed. Adnan said he had seen her at school and that she was supposed to give him a ride, but he was detained and figured she had left without him. The first 24 hours passed, then a week, then 2. The disappearance was a mystery, a gnawing void in the heart of the Woodlawn community. Flyers with Hae's smiling face were posted on telephone poles and in shop windows. Friends organized search parties, but there was no sign of her. Then, on February 9th, a maintenance worker who went by the name of Mr. S was driving through Leakin Park, a sprawling 1,200-acre urban woodland with a grim reputation in Baltimore as a place where bodies were often dumped. He had pulled over to relieve himself and walked about 127 feet into the woods. There, behind a fallen log, partially buried in a shallow grave, he saw a shock of black hair. He had found the body of Hae Min Lee. An autopsy would later confirm she had been manually strangled. The homicide investigation, led by detectives William Ritz and Gregory McGillivray, quickly zeroed in on her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. In the world of homicide investigation, the ex is almost always the first suspect. They interviewed her friends and learned of the intense secret relationship. They saw a motive, jealousy, a proud young man his honor spurned, driven to murderous rage. It's a simple, powerful, and timeless story. But they had no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers from Adnan found on Hae's body or in her car, which was discovered abandoned in a residential lot weeks after her disappearance. The case was purely circumstantial. To make it stick, they needed more. They needed a witness. The break came on February 12th, when police received an anonymous phone call. The caller, whose identity remains a point of contention to this day, told them to look at Adnan and to talk to his friend, a young woman named Yasser. This was likely a mistake for Adnan's friend, Jay. This tip led them to Jen Pusateri, a close friend of Jay Wilde's. When questioned, Jen told police a shocking story. Jay had told her that Adnan had killed Hae and had shown him the body. Jay, she said, had helped Adnan bury her. With that, the police had their witness. They brought in Jay Wilde's, and over the course of 2 long, taped interviews, the state's case against Adnan Syed was born. It's a story as old as time, but the evidence to support it was anything but timeless. It was novel, complex, and highly technical for its era. There was no physical evidence tying Adnan to the crime scene. The state's case rested almost entirely on 2 pillars: the testimony of that mutual friend, Jay Wilde's, and a handful of calls logged on Adnan's brand-new cell phone. Jay claimed that Adnan had not only confessed to the murder, but had enlisted his help in burying Hae's body in Leakin Park. The cell phone records, the prosecution argued, corroborated Jay's story, placing Adnan's phone near the park on the evening of the murder. With this, the state painted a picture for the jury. Adnan Syed, the spurned lover, strangled Hae Min Lee in her car in the parking lot of a Best Buy, stuffed her body in the trunk, and then spent the afternoon with Jay before burying her late that evening. In 2000, a jury found Adnan Syed guilty of murder, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years. The case was closed. The story was set in stone. But stories, especially those built on the malleable substance of memory and circumstantial evidence, rarely stay buried forever. For more than a decade, Adnan Syed's case faded into the anonymity of the American prison system. But then, in 2014, it was exhumed. Not by a court, but by a podcast. Serial, hosted by journalist Sarah Koenig, reinvestigated the murder of Hae Min Lee in weekly installments, turning millions of listeners into amateur detectives. The podcast peeled back the layers of the state's narrative, exposing the profound inconsistencies in Jay's testimony, the unreliability of the 1999 cell phone technology, and the questions that were never asked by a defense attorney who was, by many accounts, failing. Suddenly, the rock-solid case looked like something else entirely, a house of cards. Today, we dissect the anatomy of that reinvestigation. We will not be dissecting the anatomy of a perfect murder, but the anatomy of an imperfect prosecution. We will explore how a narrative of guilt, once constructed, can become so powerful that it blinds investigators and jurors to contradictory evidence. We will examine the fragile architecture of the state's case, the shifting testimony of its star witness, and the ambiguous science of cell tower pings, and how it was systematically deconstructed years later. This is a story about how public scrutiny, powered by a new form of media, can force the justice system to re-examine its own conclusions, raising profound and uncomfortable questions about memory, truth, and the very meaning of a final verdict. This is the story of what happens when a case, long thought closed, is cracked wide open. To truly grasp the case the state of Maryland built against Adnan Syed, you have to immerse yourself in the world of 1999. It was a world on the cusp of a technological revolution, but not yet fully engulfed by it. Mobile phones were a novelty, a status symbol, not a ubiquitous appendage. They were clunky plastic bricks with monochrome screens, their primary function being voice calls. Texting was a cumbersome process of tapping numbers on a keypad. GPS was a military technology, not a feature in your pocket. This technological context is not just trivia. It is the very landscape upon which the entire investigation was built, and ultimately upon which it would falter. Adnan Syed had received his first cell phone, a Nokia 6160, just 2 days before Hae Min Lee disappeared. The phone and the records associated with it became the state's silent, unblinking witness. When police obtained the call detail records for January 13th, they had a list of incoming and outgoing calls, their durations, and, crucially, the cell tower that routed each call. To lead Detective William Ritz and prosecutor Kevin Urich, this log was a treasure map. They believed it could trace Adnan's movements throughout the day of the murder. But they had a problem. The map was written in a language they couldn't read. It was just a list of numbers, timestamps, and tower identification codes. They needed a translator, a guide who could turn this raw, impersonal data into a human narrative. That guide, their Rosetta Stone, was Jay Wilds. Jay was an acquaintance of Adnan's, a bit of an outsider in their social circle. He was a year older, had graduated the previous year, and was known for selling marijuana. His connection to Adnan was somewhat peripheral, revolving mostly around music, parties, and pot. He was, however, the boyfriend of Stephanie, one of Adnan's closest and oldest friends. This connection gave him a legitimate, if tenuous, link to Adnan's life. He was not one of Adnan's core group of friends. But on January 13th, according to the state's theory, he became Adnan's accomplice and confidant in murder. When police, tipped off by Jay's friend Jen Pusateri, first brought him in for questioning, he initially denied any involvement. But over the course of 2 lengthy, unrecorded and then recorded interviews, and then in his testimony at 2 separate trials, a detailed story emerged. It was a story that critically changed in its particulars with each telling, but the core accusation remained the same. Adnan Syed killed Hae Min Lee. Let's walk through the version of the story that the second jury heard. The one stitched together by prosecutor Kevin Urich from the most prosecutorial-friendly elements of Jay's various statements and the state's interpretation of the cell phone log. The day began, according to Jay, with a strange request. Adnan, the proud owner of a new car and a brand-new cell phone, lent both to Jay. Adnan's stated reason was so Jay could drive to the mall and buy a birthday present for his girlfriend, Stephanie. The prosecution's implied reason was far more sinister. So Adnan would have an alibi, a way to be mobile after the murder, and a co-conspirator to call upon. Jay was to wait for a call from Adnan on Adnan's own phone when the deed was done. That call, Jay testified, came at 3:32 p.m. Adnan allegedly said, "Come and get me. I'm at Best Buy." When Jay arrived at the Best Buy on Security Boulevard, he claimed he saw Adnan standing by a payphone. Adnan then opened the trunk of Hae's Nissan Sentra, and inside Jay saw her body. Her skin was pale, her lips were blue, her body contorted. Adnan, according to Jay, was not remorseful, but proud, boasting about how he had done it. He said he'd strangled her with his bare hands. The motive? Jay testified that Adnan was devastated by the breakup, unable to move on. He couldn't stand to see Hae with someone new. He had told Jay just days before that he was going to kill her, a statement Jay initially dismissed as dramatic bluster. The state presented this as cold, calculated premeditation. From there, Jay's story takes them on a surreal and chilling journey across Baltimore County, a journey that prosecutors mapped meticulously onto the cell phone log. They left Hae's car, with her body in the trunk, at the Best Buy. They drove to a friend's house, then to the home of a drug dealer named Pat to buy weed. They drove around smoking, all while Hae's body lay a few miles away. During this period, Adnan received several calls on his cell phone, calls that would become crucial pieces of the state's case. One was from Hae's new boyfriend, Don. 2 were from Officer Adcock, who was now officially looking for the missing girl. Jay testified that Adnan acted cool and collected, calmly telling the officer he had seen Hae at school and she was supposed to give him a ride. But he got detained, and she must have left without him. This, the prosecution argued, was the cold calculation of a sociopath, weaving a web of lies just hours after committing the ultimate act of violence. One of the most critical calls of the afternoon in the state's telling was the Nisha call at 3:32 p.m. Nisha was a young woman Adnan had recently met and was interested in. The state argued that Adnan, wanting to establish an alibi and appear normal, made a call to her and put Jay on the phone. This would prove that Adnan and Jay were together that afternoon, just as Jay claimed. Later that evening, around 7 p.m., Jay said they returned to Hae's car. They drove it to Leakin Park, using a shovel and pickaxe that Jay had supposedly retrieved from his house earlier. They dug a shallow grave and buried Hae Min Lee. After the burial, they disposed of Hae's belongings and the tools in various dumpsters, and Jay dropped Adnan back at his car. The state's timeline was precise, almost minute by minute, and it was all mapped onto the cell phone call log. An outgoing call at 2:36 p.m. was, they argued, Adnan calling Jay to make sure he was ready. A call at 3:15 p.m. was Adnan calling Jay's friend Jen, looking for Jay. The 3:21 p.m. call was the come and get me call. Later calls in the evening at 7:09 p.m. and 7:16 p.m. pinged a cell tower, L689B, whose coverage area included a portion of Leakin Park. For the prosecution, this was the smoking gun. Ironclad, objective proof that Adnan's phone, and therefore Adnan, was at the burial site, exactly as Jay had described. To the jury, this was a compelling and coherent narrative. It had a clear motive, jealousy. It had a detailed confession from an eyewitness accomplice. And it was all corroborated by the objective, impartial data of modern technology. It explained everything. It accounted for Adnan's whereabouts. It explained how the body got to Leakin Park. And it provided a chilling portrait of a young man leading a dark double life. The prosecutor, Kevin Urich, was a masterful storyteller. He portrayed Adnan as a manipulative mastermind, and Jay as a terrified kid from a rougher background, a reluctant accomplice who only participated out of fear of Adnan and his supposed connections. Jay's many inconsistencies, Urich explained them away as the natural product of fear, trauma, and a desire to minimize his own involvement. He was scared. He didn't want to be a snitch. These were plausible explanations for a jury looking to make sense of a horrific and senseless crime. Urich also skillfully deployed a cultural subtext. He suggested to the jury that Adnan, as a Muslim of Pakistani heritage, felt a unique shame and anger at being dumped by Hae, particularly for a white, non-Muslim young man. In his closing arguments, he stated that Adnan's honor had been besmirched and that he committed murder to reclaim it. This narrative, while inflammatory and trafficking in harmful stereotypes, provided a powerful, albeit prejudicial, psychological explanation for why a seemingly normal, popular teenager would snap. The defense, led by the renowned but mercurial attorney Cristina Gutierrez, was expected to dismantle this story. But her performance was, in hindsight, catastrophic. She was a formidable, highly paid lawyer with a reputation for aggressive litigation, but she was also reportedly struggling with health and financial issues that would later lead to her disbarment. Her cross-examination of Jay failed to effectively highlight the dramatic inconsistencies in his story as it evolved over time. She failed to challenge the nascent and unproven reliability of the cell tower evidence, and, in what would become the most critical failure of all, she failed to contact a potential alibi witness. A young woman named Asia McLean, a fellow student at Woodlawn, had written 2 heartfelt letters to Adnan in prison shortly after his arrest. In them, she stated clearly that she remembered speaking with Adnan in the Woodlawn Public Library on the afternoon of January 13th, at the exact time the state claimed he was murdering Hae Min Lee. She remembered the conversation distinctly because they discussed the recent ice storm and Adnan's breakup with Hae. She even had her boyfriend with her, who could potentially corroborate. This was a direct, credible alibi from a witness with no motive to lie, an alibi that placed Adnan away from the scene of the crime during the state's tight timeline. Adnan gave the letters to Gutierrez's clerk, yet Christina Gutierrez's team never called her. The alibi that could have potentially freed Adnan's Syed never made it into the courtroom. Gutierrez's strategy seemed to be to suggest that Jay was a liar and the real killer, but she offered the jury no alternative theory of the crime, no evidence to support this claim. In the face of the state's detailed, tech-supported story, this was not enough. The jury was left with a choice: believe Jay, whose story was messy but complete and backed by phone records, or believe Adnan, who could only say he didn't know exactly where he was that afternoon, because, to him, it was just another day. He was likely at the library, or at track practice, which he never missed. He couldn't remember the specifics. In the grim calculus of a murder trial, a confident liar is often more persuasive than an uncertain truth-teller. So, in February of 2000, after a 6-week trial, the first had ended in a mistrial after the jury overheard the judge calling Gutierrez a liar. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. Adnan Syed, 17 years old at the time of the crime, was sent away for the rest of his life. For Hae Min Lee's family, it was a measure of justice, a painful closure. For the state of Maryland, it was another successful prosecution. The narrative was complete, the book was closed, and the complex, messy reality of January 13, 1999 was compressed into a simple, digestible story of teenage love, jealousy, and murder. And for 14 years, that was the only story anyone knew. The first crack in the foundation of Adnan Syed's conviction did not come from a courtroom. It came through a pair of headphones. In the fall of 2014, journalist Sarah Koenig, a producer for the public radio show This American Life, launched a new podcast called Serial. The concept was simple, but revolutionary for the time. One story, told week by week. The story she chose was Adnan's. The case had been brought to her by Rabia Chaudhry, a family friend of the Syeds, and an attorney who had believed in Adnan's innocence from the very beginning. For years, Chaudhry had been a tireless advocate, trying to get someone, anyone, to look closer at the case. In Koenig, she found a willing investigator with a national platform. What followed was a cultural phenomenon. Serial became the most downloaded podcast of all time, captivating tens of millions of listeners around the world and essentially launching the true crime podcast genre into the mainstream. Koenig's methodical, transparent, and often self-doubting narration guided the audience back through the tangled evidence of 1999. She wasn't a prosecutor or a defense attorney. She was a journalist, asking the questions that it seemed no one had bothered to ask with any rigor before. And as she did, the state's seemingly airtight case began to leak from 1,000 different places. The first and most significant pillar to crumble under Koenig's scrutiny was the testimony of Jay Wilds. Koenig and her team didn't just read the trial transcripts. They unearthed the original police interview tapes and laid out Jay's different statements side by side. His first police interview, his second, his trial testimony, and a new interview he gave to The Intercept years later. This comparative analysis revealed a story that wasn't just inconsistent, it was fundamentally unstable. The details didn't just shift, they transformed in ways that defied simple explanations of fear or faulty memory. For example, the trunk pop, the dramatic moment Adnan allegedly revealed Hae's body, was the centerpiece of Jay's story. But where did it happen? In his first police interview, Jay said it happened outside his grandmother's house. In the second interview, it moved to the parking lot of a Best Buy. At trial, he said it was at Best Buy. In his later interview with The Intercept, he claimed it happened at the Mondawmin Mall. The timeline of the afternoon also warped dramatically. Where they went, who they saw, when they smoked weed, when they retrieved the shovels. These crucial details morphed with each retelling. The burial time shifted by hours. Even the location where they allegedly smoked marijuana changed from Patapsco State Park to a friend's house. These were not minor slips of memory. They were foundational changes to the spine of the narrative. Serial forced listeners to ask a critical question. If Jay was telling the truth, why couldn't he keep his story straight? The podcast raised a deeply unsettling possibility that the police were feeding Jay information, helping him shape his story to fit the evidence they already had, namely the cell phone log. Koenig highlighted moments in the taped interviews where detectives can be heard saying things like, "Let's track the pings," or referencing the call log, seemingly guiding Jay's memory to align with the data. Was Jay's testimony a genuine recollection, or was it a narrative constructed in an interrogation room, co-authored by detectives who had already decided on their suspect? The podcast didn't offer a definitive answer, but it made the question impossible to ignore. The second pillar of the state's case, the cell phone evidence, proved to be even shakier. Koenig did something the original defense team never did. She consulted experts in 1999-era radio frequency engineering. What she discovered was damning. The science of using cell tower pings to determine a phone's location was, at the time, a crude and inexact art. A single cell tower could have a coverage area of several miles. A phone pinging a certain tower only meant it was somewhere within that large, irregular radius, not standing at its base. But the most explosive revelation, the true smoking gun of the podcast, came from a fax cover sheet. When AT&T provided the cell records to the Baltimore police, they included a standard cover sheet with a technical warning. It stated, in unambiguous terms, outgoing calls only are reliable for location status. Any incoming calls will not be considered reliable information for location. This was a critical distinction. The technology at the time meant that when you made an outgoing call, the network logged the tower that initiated the call. But for an incoming call, the network might log a tower associated with the phone's last known registration point, not its location at the moment the call came in. And which calls did the state use to place Adnan Syed's phone in Leakin Park at the time of the burial? The two most important calls, at 7:09 p.m. and 7:16 p.m., were both incoming calls. According to the network provider's own disclaimer, the very evidence used to corroborate the burial story was scientifically invalid for that purpose. It was available to the defense as part of discovery. Yet, Cristina Gutierrez never used it. She never challenged the state's cell phone expert on this point. The jury was presented with the cell tower pings as hard, scientific fact, when in reality they were deeply flawed and accompanied by a manufacturer's warning that they were not to be trusted for this exact purpose. Then there was the issue of Asia McClain. Serial found her. She was now married with children, living in another state. When Koenig contacted her, she confirmed the story she had told in her letters all those years ago. She remembered the day clearly. She remembered talking to Adnan in the library. She was baffled that no one from the defense had ever reached out to her. Her testimony, if presented to the jury, would have directly contradicted the state's narrow timeline of the murder, which had to have occurred between 2:15 p.m., when school let out, and 2:36 p.m., the time of the first significant outgoing call on Adnan's phone. If Adnan was in the library with Asia until at least 2:40 p.m., the state's entire theory of the crime fell apart. Serial made Asia McClain a household name, and her forgotten alibi a symbol of a catastrophic defense failure. The global reinvestigation sparked by Serial was unprecedented. Listeners organized on platforms like Reddit, crowdsourcing their own investigations. They scrutinized documents, analyzed maps, and proposed countless theories. This massive, decentralized effort uncovered more questions. The Nisha call, for example, was presented by the state as proof Adnan and Jay were together. But Nisha herself told Koenig she thought the call happened a different week, when she knew Adnan was working at a video store. Furthermore, the call was 2 minutes and 22 seconds long, an unusually long time for a butt dial, which was the only other explanation if Jay wasn't meant to be on the phone. The lividity evidence on Hae's body, the way blood settles after death, was examined by forensic experts who suggested it was more consistent with her body being laid out flat for a significant period of time, not contorted in a car trunk for over 6 hours as Jay had claimed. The podcast didn't exonerate Adnan Syed. Sarah Koenig herself concluded the series by admitting she remained on the fence. But what Serial did, unequivocally, was dismantle the state's case. It demonstrated that the conviction was not the result of overwhelming evidence, but of a compelling narrative built upon a foundation of unreliable testimony, misinterpreted technology, and a profound failure of legal defense. It showed how confirmation bias could lead investigators to ignore contradictory clues. The police had their story, jilted lover, honor killing, and they found a witness and a call log that they could mold to fit it. The reinvestigation revealed that the original trial was not a search for truth, but a battle of stories. The prosecution told a better, simpler, more coherent story, and in the absence of a compelling counter-narrative from the defense, their story won. Serial gave Adnan Syed the defense he never had. It presented an alternative story, the story of a flawed investigation and a possible miscarriage of justice. And that news story was powerful enough to reopen the doors of the courthouse that had been closed to Adnan for over a decade. The seismic impact of Serial was not just cultural, it was legal. The global attention and public outcry provided the momentum for a new legal team for Adnan Syed, led by attorney C. Justin Brown. Armed with the issues unearthed by the podcast and their own subsequent investigation, they began a new series of appeals. The anatomy of the reinvestigation now moved from the airwaves back into the courtroom, focusing on two key arguments: the failure of Christina Gutierrez to pursue the credible alibi of Asia McClain and her failure to challenge the flawed and misleading cell tower evidence. This formed the basis of an ineffective assistance of counsel claim, a notoriously difficult argument to win in the American legal system. It requires proving not only that the original lawyer's performance fell below an objective standard of reasonableness, but also that there is a reasonable probability that, but for the lawyer's unprofessional errors, The result of the proceeding would have been different. In 2016, Adnan's team was granted a post-conviction relief hearing. It was a dramatic, surreal moment. For the first time, Asia McClain took the stand and testified under oath that she had been with Adnan in the Woodlawn Library on the afternoon of the murder. She was a credible, composed witness. Also taking the stand was a new defense expert on cell phone technology who explained in painstaking detail the significance of the AT&T fax cover sheet and why the Leakin Park pings, based on incoming calls, were scientifically worthless for placing Adnan at the burial site. In a stunning victory for the defense, Judge Martin Welch agreed. He vacated Adnan Syed's conviction and ordered a new trial, finding specifically that Gutierrez's failure to cross-examine the state's cell expert on the reliability of the tower locations constituted ineffective assistance of counsel. The courtroom erupted. For Adnan's family and supporters, it was the moment they had been fighting for 17 years. The celebration, however, was short-lived. The state of Maryland, unwilling to concede, immediately appealed the decision. The case then entered a years-long legal labyrinth, winding its way up through the Maryland appellate courts. The Court of Special Appeals, an intermediate court, upheld Judge Welch's decision to grant a new trial. But then, in March of 2019, the state's highest court, the Maryland Court of Appeals, reversed it. In a crushing 4-3 decision, the majority agreed that Gutierrez's performance had been deficient in failing to investigate the Asia McClain alibi. However, they ruled that it did not ultimately prejudice the outcome of the trial. They reasoned that even if the jury had heard from Asia, the state's case, particularly Jay Wild's testimony and the other cell phone calls, was still strong enough that the verdict would likely have been the same. They also dismissed the cell tower issue on a procedural technicality. Adnan Syed's conviction was reinstated. It seemed all legal avenues had been exhausted. The story, once again, appeared to be over. But the reinvestigation was not finished. It had taken on a life of its own. In 2021, a new Maryland law took effect, allowing people convicted of crimes as juveniles to petition for a sentence modification after serving at least 20 years. Adnan's legal team, now including prosecutors from the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office's own Sentencing Review Unit, used this new law to take a fresh look at the entire case file. This time, working collaboratively, the defense and a new set of prosecutors unearthed information that had been sitting in the original police and prosecutor files for over 2 decades, but had never been turned over to the defense. This was a bombshell of a different magnitude. Under a landmark Supreme Court ruling, Brady v. Maryland, prosecutors have a constitutional duty to disclose any exculpatory evidence to the defense, that is, any evidence that might be favorable to the accused, either by suggesting innocence or by impeaching the credibility of state witnesses. What the joint investigation found was a clear and staggering Brady violation. They found notes from the original investigation that pointed to at least 2 other viable, alternative suspects. One of these suspects was known to police and had explicitly threatened to kill Hae Min Lee, stating he would make her disappear. Another suspect had a significant criminal record, including convictions for serial rape and sexual assault. This same suspect was linked to the area where Hae's car was found abandoned. Furthermore, the newly discovered notes revealed that the police knew one of these suspects might have a motive to harm Hae. Most damningly, this information was known to the original prosecution team. None of it was ever given to Cristina Gutierrez or Adnan's trial team. The defense in 2000 went to trial believing the state had no evidence of any other suspects, when in fact, the state possessed precisely that. The existence of credible alternative suspects that the defense was never able to investigate or present to the jury was a profound revelation. It wasn't just about a shaky timeline or faulty cell data anymore. This was evidence that the police may have had credible leads pointing away from Adnan, which were never pursued or, at the very least, were never disclosed as legally required. In light of this, the Baltimore City State's Attorney, Marilyn Mosby, took the extraordinary step of filing a motion to vacate Adnan Syed's conviction. In her filing, she stated that the state no longer has confidence in the integrity of the conviction. On September 19, 2022, in a dramatic and surreal court hearing, a judge officially vacated the conviction. Adnan Syed, after spending 23 years in prison for a crime he always maintained he did not commit, walked out of the courthouse a free man, blinking in the sunlight. The state was given 30 days to decide whether to seek a new trial or drop the charges completely. The reinvestigation then turned to the last remaining piece of evidence, DNA. Advanced DNA testing was conducted on Hae Min Lee's shoes, clothing, and fingernail clippings. Testing that was not available with the same sensitivity in 1999. In October 2022, the results came back. No trace of Adnan Syed's DNA was found on any of the items tested. Days later, prosecutors formally dropped all charges against him, officially exonerating him. The anatomy of this reinvestigation ultimately laid bare the deep, systemic fallibility of the justice system. It demonstrated how a compelling narrative, once adopted by law enforcement, can create a kind of tunnel vision, causing investigators to overlook or even suppress evidence that points away from their chosen suspect. The original case against Adnan was a story constructed from the ambiguous fragments of memory and the nascent, misunderstood language of mobile technology. It was a story that felt true to a jury in 2000, but it could not withstand the rigorous, multifaceted scrutiny it was subjected to 2 decades later. The outcome leaves us in a place of profound and tragic uncertainty. Adnan Syed is free, his name cleared, but the central horror remains. Hae Min Lee was brutally murdered in 1999, her vibrant life and brilliant future stolen from her. The reinvestigation that freed Adnan also dismantled the only official explanation for her death. Her murder is now, once again, an unsolved case. Her family, who believed for 2 decades that they had justice, has had that certainty ripped away. They are left with only questions, their unimaginable grief compounded by decades of legal battles that centered not on Hae, but on the man convicted and later freed of killing her. The case of Adnan Syed is a stark illustration that a verdict is not synonymous with the truth. It is merely the conclusion of one particular telling of a story, based on the evidence presented in a courtroom at a specific moment in time. But stories can be retold, evidence can be re-examined. Science evolves, and new information can surface. The reinvestigation of this case, driven by a podcast, championed by advocates, and ultimately validated by the legal system itself, forced a reckoning with a past that was thought to be settled. It exposed the ghosts in the timeline, the cracks in the testimony, and the suppressed facts hidden for more than 20 years within the state's own files. The final chapter of this story is yet to be written. The search for Hae Min Lee's killer is, in theory, ongoing, focused now on those undisclosed suspects from 1999. But the case no longer belongs only to the justice system. It belongs to the public consciousness, a permanent and powerful cautionary tale about the immense danger of a story too easily believed, and the profound difficulty of undoing an injustice once it has been codified into a verdict. It reminds us that memory is fallible, technology can be misleading, and the truth is often far more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. The reinvestigation may have freed a man, but it has not yet found a killer, leaving the life and death of Hae Min Lee suspended in a state of unresolved justice. For over 20 years, the system had an answer for who killed Hae Min Lee. Now, all it has is a question. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.